On March 4, 2024, Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister Ali Bagheri Khani sat down at a conference table in Geneva, Switzerland, across from European Union mediators, and made a public statement that was carried simultaneously by Reuters, the Associated Press, and the Iranian state news agency IRNA. He said, and this is taken directly from the IRNA English language transcript, Iran's presence here reflects our genuine commitment to diplomatic resolution and regional de-escalation. Hold on to that phrase. Genuine commitment to diplomatic resolution. Hold it for the next 20 minutes. Because in the same 72-hour window that Bagheri Khani was speaking those words in Geneva, a fleet of Iranian surveillance drones, documented in U.S. Central Command's own after-action assessment and reported by the Wall Street Journal in August 2024, was conducting systematic reconnaissance passes over Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates, and the Forward Logistics Hub at Camp Arifjan in Kuwait. Not casual observation, not opportunistic flybys. Systematic mapping, with loiter patterns consistent with targeting data collection, radar cross-section profiling of hardened shelters, air defense radar emission cataloging, fuel storage facility documentation, and runway approach corridor geometry. The kind of data you collect when you are not planning to negotiate. The kind of data you collect when you are planning to strike. These two things cannot both be true simultaneously. Either Iran was genuinely committed to diplomatic resolution in Geneva on March 4, 2024, or Iran was using the diplomatic engagement as a scheduling device, a way to keep American senior analytical and policy attention focused on a negotiating table in Switzerland while a targeting data collection operation ran undisturbed across 3 Gulf states. Today, in the next 28 minutes, I am going to show you that the second explanation is not only more accurate than the first, it is the product of a deliberate, documented, and historically grounded Iranian strategic doctrine that has been in continuous development for over a decade, and that Washington has consistently failed to name, failed to analyze, failed to counter. Right now, the conversation in the major Western foreign policy institutions is focused on one question. Is Iran sincere at the negotiating table? CNN is running segments on whether European mediators can revive a diplomatic framework for the nuclear file. The BBC is asking whether the hardliner faction in Tehran has sufficient control to block any deal that moderates might reach. Fox is asking whether any agreement reached with the current Iranian government is worth the verification mechanism it requires. Every one of those conversations is the wrong conversation. They share a common foundational assumption that diplomacy and intelligence collection exist on separate tracks, and that a state's willingness to send its deputy foreign minister to Geneva tells you something meaningful about what that state's military planners are doing on a different track at the same moment. That assumption is precisely the analytical error that today's framework is designed to correct. Because if the assumption is wrong, the entire Western analytical and policy architecture built on it is operating against a reality it cannot see. The framework is called diplomatic cover operations, and I want to be precise about what the term means, because it is not synonymous with lying at a negotiating table, and it is not the same as bad faith negotiation in the conventional diplomatic sense. The distinction is important, so let me explain it from first principles. In standard diplomatic theory, a state engages in negotiations when it wants an outcome that negotiation can produce. Bad faith negotiation, in this model, means pretending to want a deal while privately intending to walk away from it, use the negotiating period to rearm or exploit any concessions for unilateral advantage. Sophisticated diplomatic interlocutors understand this risk and build verification mechanisms and sequence concession structures to limit it. Both sides understand that the other may be operating in bad faith, and both sides try to limit the damage of that possibility. A diplomatic cover operation is structurally different, and understanding the difference is the entire analysis. In a DCO, the state is not at the negotiating table because it wants a deal. It is not particularly concerned, in the operational sense, whether the talks succeed or fail. The negotiating table is not the objective. The negotiating table is the alibi. The state's actual operational objective is occurring simultaneously in a different geographic theater, and the diplomatic engagement provides 3 specific specific operational benefits that would not exist in the absence of the diplomatic process. First, it occupies the adversary's senior analytical, intelligence, and policy attention. Senior analysts and policymakers who are managing an active diplomatic process are reading diplomatic cables, preparing position papers, briefing congressional committees, and running interagency coordination sessions. Their attention is a finite resource. Diplomatic engagement consumes it in a specific direction. Second, it creates a political and strategic incentive for the adversary to avoid escalatory action during the period of the talks. No government wants to be seen as having blown up a diplomatic process it initiated or encouraged. That incentive for restraint provides operational freedom in the collection theater, because the collection operation can run at higher tempo with lower risk of triggering a response that would be politically costly for the adversary to authorize while talks are active. Third, diplomatic engagement generates intelligence through the goodwill process itself. States that are actively engaged in diplomacy tend to share contextual information with their interlocutors as demonstrations of seriousness, as confidence-building measures, and as the ordinary flow of diplomatic communication. That information, in the hands of an interlocutor running a DCO, is itself part of the intelligence product. The historical anchor for this framework is not a rogue state and not a contemporary case. It is the Soviet Union between 1969 and 1972, during the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT I, negotiated under the Nixon administration. Okay? While American and Soviet negotiators were working through the framework details that would become the SALT I Treaty, Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, was running one of the most ambitious signals intelligence collection operations against American strategic nuclear forces in the entire Cold War period. The collection was not incidental to the diplomacy. It was, according to retrospective analyses by American intelligence historians, including David Hoffman and Amy Ziegart, deliberately structured around the rhythms of the diplomatic process. During phases of the SALT negotiations, when American technical delegations were presenting their own force structure data as confidence-building measures, Soviet collection platforms were most active in cataloging the radar emissions, communication frequencies, and command and control protocols associated with the systems being described. Information that American negotiators shared in good faith as part of building diplomatic trust became targeting data in Soviet strategic planning files. When the SALT I Treaty was signed in May 1972, the Soviet Union had simultaneously achieved a strategic arms limitation agreement and a more complete targeting picture of American strategic forces than it had possessed at any point in the preceding decade. The diplomacy and the intelligence collection were not two tracks running in parallel. They were one integrated operation with two simultaneous outputs. And the American side did not process what had occurred until retrospective analyses conducted years later, analyses that remained classified for decades because their conclusions were too damaging to the institutional reputation of the agencies involved. That is the diplomatic cover operation. And now watch it run in the Gulf. There are 5 pieces of evidence, and together they describe a system, not a coincidence. Number 1, the geographic distribution of Iranian reconnaissance drone incidents from 2023 to 2024, and what the targeting profile tells you about operational intent. Between January 2023 and December 2024, CENTCOM's official incident tracking logs, portions of which were declassified and reported by Defense One, the war zone, and referenced in the Congressional Research Service brief on Iranian drone activity, published in February 2025, documented 43 confirmed encounters between U.S. military assets and Iranian surveillance drones in or adjacent to American military installations across the Gulf region. 43, not 4, not 14. 43 separate confirmed incidents over a 24-month period. Now here is the detail that transforms those 43 incidents from a pattern of harassment into a pattern of something more specific and more operationally significant. The geographic distribution was not random. It was not primarily concentrated around the targets that opportunistic intelligence collection would prioritize, carrier transit routes, for example, or surface warfare picket positions. The distribution was heavily weighted toward fixed infrastructure of a very specific operational category: hardened aircraft shelters and their vehicle approach corridors, fuel and munitions, storage facilities and their ventilation signatures, air defense radar, battery emplacements and their emission characteristics, and most significantly, the ground antenna arrays that serve as the terrestrial backbone of American satellite communication links in the CENTCOM area of responsibility. Those are not the targets of a generalist intelligence collection program. Those are the targets of a pre-strike reconnaissance operation organized around a specific strike sequence: fuel storage, hardened aircraft, radar, communications. In that priority order. That is the suppression of enemy air defenses targeting sequence, documented from the ground up across 43 incidents spanning 2 years, without a single missile being fired. The locksmith was not studying the house out of curiosity. He was cutting the key. Does that make sense? Number 2, the timing correlation between diplomatic engagement windows and collection operation intensity, and why correlation here is not the only thing the data shows. This is the evidentiary pillar on which the DCO framework stands or falls, and it requires precision rather than assertion. Between March and June 2024, Iranian diplomatic engagement with European intermediaries was at its highest tempo since the collapse of the Vienna nuclear talks in 2022. There were 3 formal sessions, 2 informal exchanges, and a sustained back-channel communication flow that generated significant coverage in publications tracking Iran diplomacy, including Iran International, Reuters, and the Stimson Center's Iran Primer project. The diplomatic track was active and substantive enough that European Foreign Policy Council staff were publicly describing the period as one of the most productive engagement phases in 3 years. During this exact window, the density of Iranian reconnaissance drone activity over Gulf installations, as documented in CENTCOM incident logs and corroborated by independent analysis from the Middle East Institute and from open-source monitoring of Iranian drone activity conducted by the Conflict Armament Research Group, was at its highest point in the entire 24-month tracking period, not at its lowest point, as one would expect if diplomatic engagement reflected a genuine de-escalation posture. Its highest. When Iran was talking loudest about de-escalation in Geneva, the collection operation was running hardest over Al Udeid and Al Dhafra, and that pattern did not occur once. It occurred 3 times during the tracking period, with measurable correlation between diplomatic engagement tempo and collection operation intensity in March 2024, August 2023, and January 2024. 3 instances. A chess grandmaster does not make the same move 3 times by accident, and a state intelligence apparatus does not produce the same operational pattern 3 times by coincidence. 3 repetitions is a doctrine. Does that make sense? Number 3, the Shahed 136 deployment pattern in Yemen and what it reveals about how the Gulf targeting data is being operationally validated in real time. The Houthi drone and missile campaign against commercial and military shipping in the Red Sea, which began in earnest in late 2023 and intensified through 2024, has been analyzed almost entirely through the lens of Houthi political motivation, Iranian proxy management strategy, and the humanitarian dimensions of disrupted commercial shipping. Look at it through a different lens, the lens of weapon system performance validation, and the picture changes considerably. The Shahed 136 loitering munitions and ballistic missiles used in documented Houthi engagements against shipping and against U.S. naval vessels demonstrated in several engagement instances terminal guidance behavior that exceeded the system's factory specifications, as those specifications were understood by Western analysts before the campaign began. In October 2023, the USS Carney, operating in the northern Red Sea, intercepted Houthi projectiles in an engagement that CENTCOM's public statement described as involving guidance sophistication that had not been anticipated in pre-deployment threat assessments. The engagement required more interceptor rounds than the baseline model predicted. Where did the targeting parameter refinement come from? The Shahed 136 is an Iranian design system. The targeting data for Red Sea shipping lane geometry was partially generated by the same category of Iranian reconnaissance drone platforms that were surveying Gulf installations during the diplomatic engagement windows of 2023 and 2024. The collection was not building a static intelligence picture. It was being operationally validated in real time through the proxy campaign, with Iranian technical advisors observing the terminal engagement behavior of their weapon systems against American and Allied defensive architecture, identifying performance gaps, refining the guidance parameters, and feeding corrected data back into the targeting database that includes the Gulf installations. The Geneva Conference was not where the strategy was being built. The Red Sea was where it was being tested. Al-Udeid was where it will be applied. The diplomatic table was where the cover was being maintained, while all of it ran simultaneously. That is the system, okay? Number 4, the Al-Udeid vulnerability profile in specific technical terms, and why the targeting data the reconnaissance collected matters more than the missiles that will eventually carry it. Al-Udeid Air Base in Qatar is the largest United States Air Force installation in the Middle East. It houses approximately 10,000 American military personnel, the forward headquarters of U.S. Central Command, and the Combined Air Operations Center, the CAOC, which is the brain that manages, coordinates, and directs all American air power operations across the entire CENTCOM area of responsibility. If you want to understand what Al-Udeid means strategically, understand this. If Al-Udeid's command infrastructure is degraded or destroyed in the opening hours of a conflict, American air power in the region does not just lose one base. It loses its command brain. Every air operation in every country across the theater loses its coordination center simultaneously. The base's defensive architecture, described in general terms in publicly available CENTCOM posture statements to Congress and Air Force budget justification documents, relies on layered active defense. Patriot PA-C3 batteries covering the ballistic missile approach corridors, counter-rocket, artillery, and mortar systems for close-in defense against shorter-range threats, and the airborne early warning coverage provided by E-3 Sentry aircraft operating in coordination with regional partner radar networks. That is a substantial and capable defensive system. It has performed effectively in the scenarios it has been tested against, in exercises, and in limited operational engagements. But every layered defensive system has an architectural constraint, and Al-Udeid's constraint is this. It is optimized for sequential or small group ballistic missile threats approaching from defined azimuth corridors based on the known threat envelopes of Iranian missile systems, as those systems were characterized in pre-reconnaissance targeting assessments. It is less optimized for simultaneous saturation attacks delivered from multiple azimuths by missiles whose approach corridor geometry has been pre-calculated to exploit the angular gaps in Patriot battery coverage and whose terminal guidance parameters have been loaded with the specific radar emission frequencies and rotation rates of the defensive battery systems themselves. Now consider what the 17 documented reconnaissance drone incidents specifically focused on Al-Udeid's perimeter, according to the CRS brief data, were actually collecting during their loiter passes. Not general base layout, which is available from commercial satellite imagery, radar emission profiles, the specific frequencies at which Al-Udeid's defensive radar systems operate, their pulse repetition rates, their rotation periods, and their minimum detection range. Air defense, battery, positioning data, not just where the Patriot batteries are emplaced, which is partially visible from commercial imagery, but the precise azimuth coverage sectors each battery commands and the angular gaps between adjacent batteries that define the system's saturation threshold geometry, the approach corridors into which the batteries are oriented, and by geometric implication, the corridors they cannot adequately cover. That data, formatted into a targeting model and loaded into the pre-planned flight path database of an Iranian ballistic missile, converts Al-Udeid from a formidably defended installation into a solved engineering problem. Not a problem that will definitely be solved perfectly in execution, but a problem whose solution has been calculated, verified through proxy operational testing, and preloaded into the system. The locksmith who built the lock does not break the lock. He already knows which key opens it, and he cut it 2 years ago while the diplomats were meeting in Switzerland. Number 5, the phrase, the data is already deployed, and what it means in operational terms, because it is the most consequential phrase in today's analysis and the least understood. The data is already deployed does not mean the missiles are in the air. It does not mean an attack is imminent or inevitable. It means something more specific and in some ways more alarming than either of those things. It means that the targeting solution, the complete pre-calculated data set specifying target coordinates, optimal approach corridors, radar jamming parameters, and terminal guidance adjustment protocols, is already formatted, already verified against operational testing results results from the Red Sea campaign and already integrated into the pre-programmed flight path databases of Iranian missile systems that are ready to execute on command. Modern Iranian ballistic and cruise missile systems, including the Shahab series, the Khaybar-Shikan medium-range system, unveiled in 2022, and the Fateh-1 hypersonic glide vehicle, announced in 2023, can be preloaded with target packages before launch. Once loaded, the execution of the strike does not require real-time intelligence input at the moment of launch. It does not require a reconnaissance drone overhead during the attack. It does not require a live satellite data feed or an active signals intelligence collection platform in the theater. The system executes against the preloaded targeting picture. The intelligence collection phase, the phase that ran across 43 documented incidents over 24 months while the diplomats were meeting, is over. The next phase is a political and strategic decision, not a technical or intelligence one. The technical question, whether Iran can execute a precision strike against the identified vulnerability profiles at Al-Udeid, Al-Dhafra, and Arifjan, has been answered by 2 years of systematic collection. The answer is yes, with confidence levels that were not achievable before the reconnaissance campaign. Washington focused on the negotiating table it could see and document and analyze, never adequately processed the collection operation running simultaneously in the theater it was supposed to be protecting. Now, let the strongest argument against this analysis speak, because it deserves a complete and honest response. The counter-argument is this: Iran has been conducting surveillance of U.S. Gulf installations for decades. The current level of collection activity is not qualitatively different from the persistent intelligence effort that all regional military powers conduct against each other as a matter of routine strategic competition. Interpreting the 2023 to 2024 collection pattern through the specific DCO lens, meaning as directly integrated with the diplomatic engagement calendar and as specifically oriented toward pre-strike targeting, imposes a causal narrative onto correlation data that could equally well be explained by a simpler hypothesis. Regional tension drives both diplomatic engagement and heightened military intelligence collection simultaneously, because both are responses to the same underlying geopolitical pressure. The causality does not run from the diplomacy to the collection. Both run from the tension, and characterizing systematic intelligence collection as proof of imminent strike planning overstates the evidence and risks triggering exactly the escalation cycle it purports to be warning against. That is a serious argument. It is the argument a responsible analyst would make. But here is what it cannot explain. It cannot explain why the targeting profile of the collection is consistent with pre-strike reconnaissance rather than broad-based strategic intelligence assessment. Routine military intelligence collection against an adversary installation has a recognizable signature. It is comprehensive. It catalogs everything observable, and it is not organized around a specific operational sequence. The Iranian collection documented in the CENTCOM logs was not comprehensive in that sense. It was sequenced around suppression of enemy air defense's priorities. Radar emissions first, air defense positioning second, hardened infrastructure third, communications fourth. That sequencing is not the signature of strategic assessment. It is the signature of strike planning. It cannot explain why collection density correlated positively with diplomatic engagement tempo rather than inversely. If the tension hypothesis were correct, high diplomatic engagement, which represents a reduction in perceived immediate threat, should correlate with reduced collection activity, because the strategic rationale for aggressive pre-strike reconnaissance diminishes when the diplomatic track appears promising. The opposite correlation appeared in the data 3 times, and it cannot explain why the Houthi campaign provided an operational testing environment that generated precisely the weapons performance feedback most useful for refining a Gulf strike targeting database.